Hamas is firing rockets at Israel, and Israel is hitting back. It's a tough situation for Israel to be in, as it fights terror organizations committed to removing it from the face of the map. But something else is happening. A bigger threat to Israel is taking shape elsewhere, in China. China may not want Israel to notice its sinister plan in the Middle East, but now Israel is finally starting to realize that China is no friend, and that Xi Jinping is ready to stab Netanyahu in the back. What does this mean for China then? Well, nothing good. You really don't want Israel as your enemy in the Middle East. Hi, and welcome to TFI Global, the foreign affairs and geopolitical analysis arm of the TFI Media Group. I am your host Shubhangi, and in this video, I shall tell you about China's newfound love for Hamas and how Israel has finally woken up to smell the coffee. Let's begin. Israel is finally waking up to the big threat called the People's Republic of China. The Jewish nation has accused the Chinese state-run media of running anti-Semitic propaganda. Israel is therefore coming to realize that the Middle Kingdom is not a friend. You see, as the Israel-Gaza conflict escalated, Beijing decided to take Iran's line and support the Palestinian cause with all its might at the expense of Israel. In fact, now, China is engaging in propaganda against Israel, which is laced with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Israel is an American ally first, and this is why it is facing negative propaganda from the Chinese state media. But the biggest reason is that China has decided to side with Iran. China has signed a massive $400 billion pact with Iran, and now it has teamed up with Iran, an enemy of Israel. Ultimately, this is going to make the Jewish nation realize that it cannot sustain business ties with Beijing. Israel's realization is bound to hurt China with some serious consequences. Israel's PM Benjamin Netanyahu could now kick extensive Chinese investments out of Israel's economy, and not just that, China's strategic interests in the Middle East, those can be out of the picture too. The Israeli embassy to China pointed out a program run by China's overseas state-run broadcaster CCTV. The embassy tweeted, "We have hoped that the times of the quote-unquote Jews controlling the world conspiracy theories were over. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism has shown its ugly face again." It added, "We are appalled to see blatant anti-Semitism expressed in an official Chinese media outlet." The Israeli embassy was making a reference to the Tuesday CGTN broadcast by host Cheng Junfeng. During a 3-minute segment, Junfeng suggested that American support to Israel was driven by influence of wealthy Jews in the US and the influence of the Jewish lobby on American foreign policy. So, Israel must have realized that it is a US ally first. And since Israel is a mainstream US ally, it cannot escape the consequences of growing tensions between Washington and Beijing. In the Trump era, former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had asked Israel to distance itself from Beijing. But back then, Israel had asserted its right to exercise freedom in relations with China. But it is China, after all, a country that has traditionally supported the Palestinian cause. Even recently, the Chinese Foreign Ministry condemned the US for blocking a UN Security Council statement against Israel. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying said, "What we can feel is that the US keeps saying that it cares about the human rights of Muslims, but it was ignoring the suffering of the Palestinian people." Anyhow, Israel's realization of China's true character is quite significant, and it can really harm Beijing's interests in the region. Most importantly, business relations between Israel and China might be jeopardized. China has invested heavily in the Israeli economy. The most important of all Chinese investments is, of course, the Haifa port, which is seen as an important milestone in China's Belt and Road project. The port is in the final stages of completion and will start running from 2021 before being handed over to the SIPG, a Chinese government company, on a 25-year lease. But the Haifa port is not the only Chinese investment in Israel that now stands threatened because of a possible rift between the two countries. Chinese companies are also building an Israeli port in Ashdod and a light railways project running through the greater Tel Aviv area. The rail project is sensitive as it will pass in great geographical proximity to the Israeli military headquarters. Moreover, Hong Kong conglomerate CK Hutchinson is also building a $1.5 billion water desalination plant in the Jewish nation. China has also been investing extensively in Israeli technology and businesses. As per IVC Data and Insights, it invested $400 million in Israeli startups in 2018 and $243 million in 2019. So make no mistake, Israel feels that China has been backstabbing it, and therefore every single Chinese investment in Israel is at risk. China, with its anti-Zionist and anti-Semitist propaganda, is also indicating that it has become a national security threat to Israel. The Netanyahu government must have realized that China is an external power that tries to spread its influence in the Middle East in the garb of neutrality. But in reality, the paper dragon takes Iran's lines and pushes pro-Palestine propaganda, which can be detrimental for Israel. So China might as well get excluded from the Eastern Mediterranean and Gulf regions and get confined to exclusive places like Iran in the Middle East. China has made a huge mistake by going too far in its propaganda against Israel, and now Israel will make it pay for its mistakes.